Is personality inherited? Many of us believe it is. One of the truisms of being a parent is that if you have a couple of kids, they're so different from each other, and they seem to almost be that way in certain traits from birth. So it's tempting to conclude that the genes control a great deal of our personality. Of course, we can still shape it. In order to understand this question and to try to get into it, we have to understand the principal research method that's been used in humans, at least, to try to get at this trait. And one of them is the fraternal versus identical twin study. Now, what is an identical twin? Well, everybody knows that an identical twin is a twin that began as one egg, and then the egg split in the womb and made two completely identical copies, the same cytoplasmic DNA in the mitochondria from the mother, the same genetic DNA rearranged as the mother and father's DNA combined. So all of the genes are the same in an identical twin. The fraternal twin, on the other hand, comes from the fertilization of two eggs in the womb at the same time. But the two eggs are no more related to each other than any brother and sister would be. So if we compare fraternal and identical twins, we can get some idea about whether the trait we're talking about is influenced by the genes. Obviously, it would be more identical in twins that were identical as opposed to fraternal. Now, you can do a further study of this by looking at the unusual cases in which the identical twins were separated at birth and raised in families that were different. And in this case, we might be able to isolate more of what was coming from the genes versus what was coming from the shared environment. And these studies are very popular. And you hear stories on the news media all the time of two identical twins that are reunited as adults and find out that they have all kinds of crazy things in common, including food preferences and vacation types that they like to take and professions and, of course, personality attributes. But the question is, does this really work? And that is an important question, which we'll take on right now. As you know, I like to use the textbook wherever possible to provide information. So here on page 347, we have a discussion about the big five and having a genetic basis. And the textbook seems to be encouraging us to think that they do, talking about 1,000 sets of twins in this study, measured on 30 facets of the big five, that accounted for what they call a substantial portion of the difference between people's personality test scores. The next paragraph down takes us to the area of dysfunctional personality traits, where the textbook argues that there's some evidence that these personality traits are inherited. One of them is something that's close to my field, which is something about addiction and possibly the way the dopamine systems in the brain are organized. This all sounds very compelling. And in fact, I believe there is some genetic component and certainly an organic brain component to underlying personality traits. But it's also the case that we tend to accept evidence at a lower level for things that we believe in. For example, one of the things that undermines the twins raised apart stuff is that the orphanages sometimes tried to place these twins in environments that were similar. This brings back a bit of the environmental coherence that was supposed to be broken by the twin raised apart study. In other cases, it's not really whether there's a genetic component or not that matters. Certainly there's a genetic component. We all have two legs. But it matters whether or not the environment is played out in one way or the other, because it seems that the brain is very malleable over a lifetime, especially to environmental influences. So it doesn't mean that you are stuck with your inheritance. It might mean that it's an influence. So these are some things that I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated about in our appreciation. and we'll return to these topics also in lecture.